Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode in our exploration of the Jews during the time of return to Zion, based on texts of Shivat Zion of the return to Zion. So, what we're going to be doing tonight is we're going to be looking at ideas of Torah and the law. This is probably going to stretch out over more than just one class. We're going to start with a classic description of Ezra reading the Torah, but not just that. We're going to look at comparative items, and then we're going to continue on where with views of Shabbat, views of halacha, views of interpretation, what we can see in terms of interpretation during this period. And that some of these are going to come actually from that account, the account of Ezra reading the Torah. So before we get to Ezra reading the Torah, let's start with the introduction of Ezra in the book of Ezra, saying kind of where he's coming from and what his job is, where Torah is actually central to Ezra's job, where Nehemiah put it as his main purpose to rebuild Jerusalem. And of course, he did other things as well, but his purpose, the reason for him coming to be the Pecha, be the governor of Yehuda, was to rebuild Jerusalem. We'll see that Ezra has a different role in the way it's described. Let us take a look. All right. So we're going to very quickly read the account of Ezra coming to Israel, to Judea from Babylon. So after these things, V'chardra Ma'ela b'malchut Artaxerxes melech Paras, Ezra ben Sraya ben Azariah ben Chilkiah ben Shalom ben Sadok ben Achituv ben Amariah ben Azariah ben Mirayot ben Zrachia ben Uzi ben Buki ben Avishua ben Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen HaRosh, hu Ezra alami Babel. Ezra, who has this very long genealogy, taking us all the way back to Aaron the high priest, right? We are given the entire genealogy. Ezra is a priest. He is descended from the high priest through Tzadok, right? In other words, he himself can be considered a priest of the high priest, of possibly being a high priest. He is sent by Artaxerxes. I'll remind you that there were 4 Artaxerxes, right? And there's a general idea that Ezra perhaps was from a later Artaxerxes, even than Nehemiah's Artaxerxes. But it doesn't seem in general, if you want to talk about the scholarly approach is that Ezra and Nehemiah did not serve necessarily the same Artaxerxes, right? That they were coming at different times and they didn't actually overlap. However, certainly the book of Ezra and Nehemiah wants us to feel that they did overlap. And so we have Ezra's Torah reading in the book of Nehemiah, as opposed to staying in the book of Ezra where it probably belongs. So we have Ezra is being sent or he's coming from Babel. And it says, V'hu sofer mahir b'torat Moshe, asher natan Adonai Elohei Yisrael, v'yiten lo hamelech ki yad Adonai Elohav alav kol bakashato. So what's Ezra's role? He is a scribe who is an expert in the Torah of Moshe, right? That God gave essentially to Israel. And so because of God's mercy and benevolence to Ezra, the king will do whatever Ezra wants. And there are all sorts of other people who are coming in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. And Ki Ezra hechin levavo lidrosh et Torat Adonai v'lasot ulelamed b'Yisrael chok u'mishpat. Because Ezra had prepared himself and had dedicated himself to study the Torah of God and to do it and to teach law in Israel. And in the letter that Artaxerxes gives Ezra, HaKohen HaSofer, the scribe, the priest, right? It's telling us once again that he is a scribe who knows the laws, the commandments of God and his laws. We'll see that he says, okay, here's an order. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. He's giving him all sorts of sacrifices and gifts to bring with him and vessels. But I'm going to skip ahead to what I wanted to point out here. What is Ezra's job from the point of view of Artaxerxes? V'ant Ezra, now we're in Aramaic because we're quoting a letter from Artaxerxes. V'ant Ezra kichochmat elahach di bidach meni shaftin v'dayanin di lehevon dainin lechol ama di ba'avar nahara lechol yad'ei datei elahach v'di layada todun. So what do you do? As according to the wisdom that your God has given you, you should appoint judges And these judges are going to judge all the people in the area of Avar Nahara, or the area on the other side of the river, for all the ones who know the law of your God. And those who don't know the law of your God, you should make it known to them. In other words, you must teach them. V'chol dila leheve ave data di elahach v'data di malka asparna dina leheve mit'abed minei hen lemot hen leshroshi hen la'anach nixon v'lesurin. Okay? And anyone who doesn't obey the law of your God and the king, what should happen to him? He should get his punishment, whether it's by death, whether it's by beating, whether it's by taking his possessions, whether he's going to be imprisoned. In other words, your law is going to be the law of the land, Ezra. Your law and the king's law. Now, one of the interpretations of this in modern scholarship is that this was considered a good way to kind of control an empire. You have all these different peoples, they have all the different laws. You say, okay, this is your law. Well, you darn well better keep your law, and of course the king's law. But we're trusting you. If this is your traditional law, fine, as long as you have a law, but you darn well better keep it. So this is Ezra's role. And we see, if we skip ahead to Nehemiah, and this again, the passage now that we're going to read is almost certainly taken out of its original context because it's a text about Ezra and what Ezra does. And it's smack in the middle of Nehemiah, where in the book of Nehemiah, right after Nehemiah deals with the wall and genealogical lists of priests, etc. I'm reading from the end of Nehemiah Zion, that's Nehemiah 7. And here, because the very end of it actually is the beginning of this passage. This is it's Vayeshvu Kohanim v'Leviim v'Shorim v'Meshorim umin ha'am v'Hanetinim v'Chol Yisrael barehem. And the priests and the Levites and the gatekeepers and the singers, members of the people, and the servants and all of Israel dwelled in their cities. Vayigah hachodesh, so everything's fine. Vayigah hachodesh hashvi'i uvnei Yisrael barehem. And it came to the 7th month, and the children of Israel in their cities. V'yasvu kol ha'am ki ish echad el harchov asher lefnei shar hamayim. Vayomer le'Ezra sofer lavi et sefer Torat Moshe asher tziva Adonai et Yisrael. So the entire nation gathers to the square that is in front of the water gate, and they say to Ezra, the scribe, to bring the book of the Torah, of the teaching of Moshe, the Torah of Moshe, that God commanded Israel. They clearly all know what the book is. They're like, Ezra, you're here. You are the scribe. Your job is to teach us. Now's the time. Come and teach us. Vayevi Ezra hakohen et Torah lefnei hakahal meish v'ad isha v'chol mevin l'shmoa b'yom echad lechodesh hashvi'i. Right. So Ezra brings the Torah to the gathered audience, right? The gathered community from men, including men and women, whoever could understand well enough to listen, on the 1st of the 7th month. Now, the holiday of Rosh Hashanah is not mentioned here. However, if you want to say, well, you could say, well, they're keeping Rosh Hashanah, but they're also listening to the Torah. There's nothing here that necessarily is a problem. Ki vayikra lifnei harchov asher lifnei shar hamayim min ha'or ad machatzit hayom neged ha'anashim v'anashim v'amevinim v'oznei chol ha'am el sefer haTorah. And he read it in front of the square that was in front of the Watergate from morning until midday, opposite all the men and the women and anyone who could understand, and everyone's ears were to the book of the Torah. Okay. Vayamod Ezra sofer al migdal etz asher asula davar. Vayamod etzlo matithya v'shema v'aniah. So what does Ezra do? He stands upon a kind of a wooden pedestal, right, that they made for him to read Torah. And of course, this is where our bimah comes from. This is why you read Torah from the bimah, because we have this as an example. And so Ezra stands on it, and beside him stands all these people that we're clearly supposed to know. We don't really, okay? But all these people who are clearly supposed to be important people are all standing next to him while he reads the Torah. Vayiftach Ezra hasefer le'nei chol ha'am ki me'al kol ha'am haya uchifitcho amdu chol ha'am. So he opens the Sefer Torah in front of them, and he was above all of them. And when he opened it, they all stood up. And then everyone says, and then he blesses them. V'yarech Ezra et Hashem Elokim HaGadol. Ezra blesses God. V'yinu chol ha'am, amen, amen. B'mo'al yadehem. They all raise their hands. They say, amen, amen. V'yikdu v'yishtachavu l'Hashem apayim artz. And they all bow. We get a lot of our traditions for reading the Torah from this passage, right? Hagba, raising the Torah in front of everyone, blessing. So this is where we get a lot from this reading. And again, we have all this whole list of different people, plus ve'haleviim and the Levites, mivinim et ha'am laTorah va'am al omdam. They're all explaining the Torah to the people, and the people are standing. Now, this is a little unusual. I'll explain why. In general, Kohanim, traditionally, if you look at Vayikra, if you look at Yirmiyahu, if you look at Yecheskel, if you look at in numerous places, it's the Kohanim, it's the priests who teach Torah, right? And here it's Leviim who are teaching Torah. We'll actually see in a little bit. I'm going to bring an interesting somewhat parallel from Divrei Hayamim, where also it's the Leviim, it's the Levites who are teaching Torah, and not specifically Kohanim. But it's in Divrei Hayamim and in Chronicles, it's actually a wider group. We'll talk about that in a bit. But anyway, so the Leviim are explaining it to everyone, and everyone is standing and listening and learning. Vayikru'u b'sefer b'torat Elohim miforash v'som sechel vayavenu b'mikra. So they read in the Torah. What does it mean? Miforash. It could mean translating it. It could mean explaining it. It says, and v'som sechel, they put sense into it. They explained it, and they understood in the reading. In other words, they didn't just read it, wrote. I'm saying words. Everyone's listening and everyone's understanding. They're actually being taught. Here we have Nehemiah and Ezra actually being kind of brought together in an unusual move. So Nehemiah and Ezra, even though Nehemiah doesn't really seem to have a role here, and Ezra, a Kohen HaSofer, the priest, the scribe, Leviim hamivinim et ha'am l'chol ha'am. Excuse me, Leviim hamivinim et ha'am. And the Levites who are kind of teaching the people, they say, L'chol ha'am, to all the people, Hayom kadosh hu l'Adonai Elohechem, al titablu v'al tivku, ki vochim kol ha'am kishomam et divrei ha'Torah. They say, this day is holy, do not mourn, do not cry, because the whole nation is crying when they hear the words of the Torah. Why are they crying? Possibly because it's Rosh Hashanah and they're only now finding out about it. They didn't know it was Rosh Hashanah, and now they're crying, here's a holiday we didn't even know, or other things that they're finding out that they didn't know and they weren't keeping, and they're crying. Vayomer lahem, lechu ichlu mashmanim ushtu mamtakim v'shelchu manot le'en nachon lo, ki kadosh hayom ladonenu va'al te'atsevu ki chedvat Adonai hi ma'uschem. And he said to them, go eat fatty foods and drink sweet drinks, and send portions to anyone who doesn't have them, because this is a holy day for our God. And don't be sad, because your strength is rejoicing in God. Now, this is actually kind of a new idea, but it's a nice one. The whole point is to rejoice. You should not be sad. It's a holy day. Don't be sad. The whole point is to rejoice, and you should send manot. What does this remind us of? Of course, Mishloach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu in Purim. In Purim, I would say that Mishloach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu, sending portions on Purim, is taken from this. Why? Because here, those portions make sense. You have some people who don't have portions ready. They traveled, perhaps. They're in a place, and now they don't have food. So anyone who does have food and can give them nice food, kind of like what we would call yontif food, right? Nice quality food for them to celebrate. You should give them portions for them to eat, right? That's a reason for the portions here. Whereas in Esther, in Megillat Esther and the Megillah, it's kind of comes out of nowhere that you should send portions. I mean, it's a celebration, but why specifically send portions? Here, there's a little bit more of a reason, but it's clearly taken from here. At least I think so. V'aleviim machshim l'chol ha'am lemor hasu ki hayom kadosh v'al te'atzevu. And all the Levites, the Leviim, are going among the people. They're saying, shh, 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 shh. It's okay. It's okay. Don't be sad. It's a holy day for God. V'yalchu kol ha'am lechov l'shtot u'lishalach manot v'lasot simcha gdola ki hevinu badvarim asher hodiu lahem. And so all the people went to eat and to drink and to send portions and to make merry, because they understood the words they were told to them. So they understood it. They cried because they weren't apparently keeping things, but now they're like, no, it's a holy day. We're supposed to celebrate. And they accepted that as well. And then on the next day, they come back and they find out about Sukkot. Now, the whole thing of saying maybe it was because there was a holiday, that was all me kind of saying, why are they crying? But this next day, now we know there's a holiday that they really missed, which is Sukkot. And it says it explicitly. They didn't know about Sukkot, right? וביום השני נאספו ראשי האבות לכל העם, הכהנים והלוויים, אל עזרא הסופר ולהשכיל על דברי התורה. So the second day, all the heads and all the priests and the Levites, they all come to Ezra and they want to still continue learning the Torah, right? וימצאו כתוב בתורה אשר ציווה אדוני ביד משה אשר ישבו בני ישראל בסוכות בחג בחודש השביעי. And then all of a sudden they find out there's a holiday of Sukkot in the 7th month. That's where we are. We're in Tishrei. Right? Now, this, by the way, seems to indicate that what they were crying about before was not a holiday, right? Because all of a sudden we're making a big deal. Oh, look, there's a holiday and it's in Tishrei, and here we are in Tishrei. V'asher yashmiu v'yaviru kol b'chol areihem u'v'Yerushalayim le'mor te'u hahar v'aviu alei zayit v'alei et shemen v'alei hadas v'alei tmarim v'alei et avot lasot Sukkot kakatuv. Okay? They say, okay, so now let everyone know, go out to the mountain and bring olive branches and branches of other oily trees. This is possibly pine trees and myrtles and palms and other leafy trees, and make Sukkot from them. Make the Sukkot out of them. In other words, the arba minim, the things you're supposed to take in the Torah. How do they understand that verse? Oh, you're supposed to take them and make the Sukkot out of them, right? So here we clearly see a classic case. We call it inter-biblical interpretation, right? Where one book of the Bible has interpretation of another book of the Bible, right? Where you've got people saying, and what's nice is that what's being transmitted here are people who are reading it and like, wait, what does this mean? So why are we taking this stuff? Oh, it's to build the Sukkot. It's to build the booths. That's what we're supposed to do with these things, right? Now they're not keeping themselves just to the arba minim, just to those four things. They're doing it with all sorts of stuff, and also they're not building it out of fruit, right? Because that wouldn't make any sense. And so we see a real active interpretation here, and really kind of a description of someone who's discovering a text, what seemed at the first time in their memory, and trying to figure out, what are we supposed to do? Vayetz'u ha'am vayaviu vayasu lahem Sukkot ish al gago uv'chasortehem uv'chasorot beit Elohim uv'rchom shar hamayim uv'rchom shar Ephraim. So the nation comes and they bring all these different branches, etc. They make a Sukkot, they make the booth, each person on their roof and in their courtyards and in the courtyards of the temple and in the square by the water gate and in the square by the Ephraim gate. In other words, in all sorts of public areas. Vayasu kol ha'kahal hashavim min hashvi Sukkot vayeshu b'Sukkot ki lo asu mimei Yehoshua ben Nun ken bnei Yisrael ad hayom hahu v'tihi simcha gdola ma'od. Right? And so everyone who returned from the exile made Sukkot, and they sat in Sukkot, they sat in booths because they hadn't done it since Yehoshua ben Nun, until that day, and there was great joy. Now, obviously, if you know Tanakh, you're like, what are you talking about, right? You have Shlomo Melech, they're like, they didn't do Sukkot, it doesn't make much sense, but this is the way it's being conveyed, is that this is something new they're discovering it anew from the Torah, right? Vayikra b'sefer Torat Elohim yom b'yom min hayom harishon ad hayom hacharon ve'asu chag shivat yamim u'bayom hashmini atzeret kamishpat. And so he read it 7 days now to read the Torah. Every day he read from the Torah from the first day to the last day. They did the 7 days of holiday, and they even did Shmini Atzeret, because now they know. By the time they get to Shmini Atzeret, by the time they get to the 8th day, they know there's an 8th day holiday. So they do it according to the law, the way they're supposed to be doing it. So this is a really nice account of kind of discovering the holiday. I do want to say something interesting, because there's a question here. Okay, so let's say they had Rosh Hashanah, and let's say the learning the Torah didn't create any problems with Rosh Hashanah because they were still doing whatever they did for Rosh Hashanah. They knew, but they knew it was a holiday, and they were crying because of other things they didn't know about, right? And then that's why the Levium said to them, "Don't cry because it's a holiday today. Don't cry. You should be happy. Don't cry. Just be happy and eat good foods and drink sweet drinks." But then when it comes to Sukkot, they don't know. But what's the holiday in the middle that no one seems to be talking about?
Yom Kippur.
Everyone's muted. Right,
Yom
Yom
Kippur.
Kippur. Where's Yom Kippur? Where is Yom Kippur? So if you go back to the earliest biblical scholars who really wanted to say that practically all halacha is really late. So Velhausen wanted to say that, oh, you can see the Yom Kippur came even after Ezra. Like you didn't even have Yom Kippur wasn't even the time of Ezra. It's that late. And of course, there are also other opinions. That was just Velhausen. Sarah Yafet has a nice, I kind of like the way she puts it. She says, look, Nehemiah is not a calendar, right? It's not taking everything off a calendar. The point of the passage in Nehemiah here, and not just the point, the center of the account, strangely enough, and this is something important to note, is not the Beit HaMikdash, it's not the temple. Things aren't going on in the temple in this account. We're talking about stuff to the people. Everything's involving all of the people coming, right? The people come, they're like, now we're going to hear the Torah. The Levites are going out among the people saying, hey, everyone, eat, drink, be merry. When it comes to Sukkot, everyone's building a sukkah. They're building them all over the place. They're building them on their roofs and in their courtyards, in the different courtyards. No one's talking about the temple service in these accounts because that's not what's important. What's important is the people, all what other people are all doing. Now, Yom Kippur, the way it is biblically, is mainly something that happens in the temple. Yes, everyone's supposed to fast. I'm not saying that not. Everyone's supposed to fast, but all the actions happening in the temple by a select few or a select one, you could say, right? This is not a holiday for the people. It's not something that people are going to even notice that much besides fasting. And whereas what we're reading about here in this account is everything talking about the people and how they are celebrating and how they are learning the law and keeping the law. And that's where our center is in this passage, as opposed to any sort of ritual practice in the temple. So I'm going to pause here. I also saw that there was at least one comment. So Moshe is asking, why is Nehemiah 7-8 in Nehemiah and not in Ezra? And I think the reason that this passage, which really does belong in Ezra, is in Nehemiah, is to pull Ezra and Nehemiah closer together. Because again, and I think it's important to note, when I look at Ezra and Nehemiah, there are places where the author/editor wants to lead you to a certain conclusion, but he is not lying. He's not changing anything, right? He wants to lead you to the conclusion that the reason they didn't build the temple was because they were scared of all the nations, but he brings you letters that are talking about building the walls of Jerusalem and not building the temple. Those are the letters he's got. They're letters from much later, right? So if you're paying attention, you're like, oh, wait, that's not these letters, right? So he wants to lead you to a certain conclusion, but he's not going to like misrepresent a letter. However, when it comes to Ezra and Nehemiah being in the same generation, it is very important for the author/editor that Ezra and Nehemiah be together. So what does he do? He takes a very central part of Ezra's role and he places it in Nehemiah after Nehemiah finishes a big part of his mission, right? So Nehemiah finishes a big part of his mission, and now here's Ezra doing what he came to do. So that if you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah, you will come out saying, hey, they're both functioning at the same time, right? Even though if you actually look at the passages where they're centering on each one, Ezra's talking as if there's no Nehemiah, Nehemiah's talking as if there's no Ezra. And even though they may, by the letter of the laws or the letter of the verse, oh, here's Nehemiah next to Ezra when Ezra's teaching the Torah. But Nehemiah's not saying anything. Nehemiah's not doing anything. Nehemiah has no role. And if you're used to reading about Nehemiah, Nehemiah's always got a role. Nehemiah is very, very active. And so it really seems that it's very important for the producer of the completed work that the audience absolutely sees Ezra and Nehemiah as being in the same generation, right? And working together. Any other comments or
Yeah.
questions?
So Miriam, are you saying that are you saying that the insertion of Ezra into Sefer Nehemiah might have been a product of later editing?
It's a product of the editing of the book, right? The way we've got it has it like this. And I think it's pretty clear that it seems pretty clear there were certain pieces that this book takes and edits together, right? So there was like the Nehemiah Chronicles, and then there was the Ezra story, right? And there are certain places where things have been moved around. I see a question saying, why does the editor care to have Ezra and Nehemiah working together? Is it to have a religious and civil authority represented? Yes, it's part of with the way Ezra and Nehemiah kind of presents it. It collapses the history of Shivat Zion, of the return to Zion, into two real generations, right? You have Yoshua and Zerubbabel and the building of the temple, and you have Nehemiah and Ezra and the building of the city and the teaching of the Torah, right? So it kind of collapses everything into two generations that get it done. And then what you have is you have what becomes the classic setup of king plus high priest, right? King and Cohen and the Cohen Gadol, right? Which you have already set up from Zerubbabel and Yoshua. Zerubbabel, where he's the governor, but he's supposed to be the king, and Yoshua is the high priest. And then the idea is that Nehemiah is the Pekah, the governor, and Ezra, who is the Sofer and the Kohen, that he's the scribe and the priest, he's taking the role of the high priest in this kind of setup. And it doesn't collapse the history, it makes it much simpler. And it does kind of say, okay, now I know how we got here. The problem is it is a kind of a collapsing of history. Another aspect of this book is what they call the empty land, right? The idea that the exiles came back to an empty land and no one had stayed, right? Which is not true. It's not true. And if you read the census accounts in the beginning of the book, it really does seem that there were people who had managed to stay in the countryside. Not people who were rejected. I mean, let's put the Shomronim aside, right? There were people who were in the land of Binyamin who had just kind of had managed to stick around because they were in the countryside. They weren't in the cities that were conquered, and they managed to stick around somehow. And then you have the Babylonian exiles returning. And yet there is still this fiction, as it were, in terms of the way the story's told, that everyone in the land are returning exiles, which is not true. Cheryl, did you have a question?
Yeah, if they're so surprised, this maybe it's two-part. How many generations are they in the return? I mean, the fourth generation has returned? And what were they doing in Babylonia all these years? What practices were they doing?
That's always the question, is what were they doing in Babylonian?
Right.
Who knows? It's interesting because a lot of Jews don't return to
Israel.
I assume you had your more educated people and your less educated people, but also then the question becomes, what can you do without a temple? What do people think you can do without a temple? I was reading Shalom Paul and Yeshayahu, and he was saying, why is Shabbat like, and we'll see later on, again, probably not today, but probably in our next class, how important Shabbat is, right? Shabbat is important in Second Isaiah, like that Shabbat is a very important thing to keep. And part of that is that from before the exile, part of the reason for the exile was people weren't keeping Shabbat. Like we see that in Yirmiyahu and elsewhere, right? This idea that why were people exiled? Because they didn't keep Shabbat. And also because Shabbat was something that you could keep without the temple. Shabbat is something that can take on importance regardless of if you have a temple or not. So if you're not keeping Shabbat, why in the heck are you not keeping Shabbat? You have zero excuse, right? This was something you should have been keeping it in exile. You certainly need to keep it. Now you're back because this is the reason we were exiled, because we didn't keep Shabbat, right? That's part of the reason. So you have this idea that there are things you can keep without the temple, right? There are others, but there's so much that you can't, especially when it comes to a holiday. Now, Sukkot, what's interesting about this account of Sukkot is, again, we're talking about what does everyone do? Sukkot is a holiday that everyone's doing stuff, right? You don't need the temple to live in a sukkah, right? You don't need a temple to build a sukkah. You don't need a temple to take Aramaic. But in general, you could also read about Sukkot and say, oh, look at all the interesting sacrifices you have at Sukkot, right? It changes every day, right? So that's not at all an issue. It's not even mentioned here. this is the thing they forgot. They forgot the amami aspect, the folk aspect of it. They forgot the aspect that was given to the people, right? They're not even talking about, oh, we forgot about the sacrifices, right? Because sure, there weren't any sacrifices, and that's up to the priests to make sure they're doing the sacrifices. But this was a holiday that the regular people had something to do, right? And no, it's clearly from the account. Obviously, they weren't keeping it in Babylon. And the question is, what would they have expected? They seem to be crying that they're not doing these things in the land. I'm not so sure they're even thinking about we should have been keeping this in Babylon. I think that they're just thinking of, here we are in the land. We were supposed to be doing this since we got back, certainly. Right? Because what's interesting is Ezra, he's coming from Babylon. So did he read the Torah to people in Babylon? Did people in Babylon know all this stuff that now everyone else is learning? Now everyone in Judea is learning? Right? What was his role in Babylon? Was he teaching people there? Whether he was or not, it's not important. It's much less important than him teaching the people who are actually in Judea. They're the ones who really need to keep things. They're the ones where it's important. But also part of it is because they are rebuilding. They are the generation that have to do everything and not get kicked out again. Moshe Matityahu is asking, is there anything in the pre-exilic prophets indicating that the exile was on account of Shabbat desecration or even rebuking the people for not observing Shabbat? Okay, so mainly it's in the prophets of the exile. So Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel talk about that. Yirmiyahu, Yud Zayin, Chaf Zayin, so that would be 1727. Yechezkel, Chaf Yud Gimel, 2013, and Chaf Aleph, Chaf Dalet, and Chaf Hey, 21 to 21, chapter 21, I believe, and verses 24 to 25. So that's where you can look it up. So the idea that the exile is because of Shabbat is seen more in Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, the prophets of the destruction, as opposed to earlier prophets. So I would like to compare, in the time that we have left, is to just take a quick look at another description of teaching Torah in Shivat Zion. And we're going to keep on coming. We're going to come back to this in our next class as well, just in terms of the ideas. But let's take a quick look at Divrei Hayamim Chronicles, Second Chronicles. Let me say a little bit about Divrei Hayamim, about Chronicles, before we start. Actually, let's talk a little bit about what this book is. Okay, so Divrei Hayamim, in English called Chronicles, is a retelling of particularly Shmuel and Malachim, particularly Samuel and Kings, right? It starts earlier, but really it's concentrated on retelling the kind of the history of the kings of Judah and Israel. It does it, though. First of all, it is clearly using sources it has Shmuel as a source, it has Malachim, Kings, as a source, and it's using other sources that we don't have. It has other sources it's pulling from, and it also has certain ideas it wants to get across. When is it written? It's written in the Second Temple period, in Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. Is it earlier than Ezra and Nehemiah? Is it later than Ezra and Nehemiah? There's reason to say it's later because it talks about it, the way it talks about the temple and the way Kohanim and Leviim, priests and Levites, serve in the temple, that you have the 24 mishmarot, the 24 watches that are very strict. It seems to be an already very clearly set up service in the temple that it's referring to and that it knows of and that everyone's kind of involved in. And so it seems to be a much later stage of everything, of the way things work in the temple. Okay, so for that reason, it seems to be later than Ezra and Nehemiah. While in the strongest Jewish tradition, it says it was written by Ezra, you also have other opinions that was written by Haggai or Zechariah or Malachi, or Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Mainly commentators on Divrei Hayamim, on Chronicles, are the ones who generally say that it may be written by Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. At any rate, it seems to be, it's from the general return to Zion period. It isn't, there are, of course, always scholars who want to put things super late. It does not seem to be super late. It's not talking in a Hellenistic world, right? Seems to be, let's say, at the end of the Persian period, at the latest. okay? Because it doesn't seem to know anything of Hellenism or anything like that. So let's jump in. And the passage that we're going to read is talking about Yehoshaphat, right? A Judean, the king of Judah, who is a good king. He is a good, worthy king. And so it gives us some interesting information here. I am reading from, make myself here, from Divrei Yamim Bet Yud Zayin, 2 Chronicles 17. I'm reading from verse Zayin, from verse 7. ובשנת 3 למלכו שלח לשריו לבן חיל ולעובדיה ולזכריה ולנתנאל ומחייהו ללמד בערי יהודה. Okay, so he sends, so in the 3rd year of his reign, in other words, relatively early in his reign, he sends his officers, of all these different officers, in other words, his nobles, he's sending them to teach in the cities of Yehuda. They are going to teach. V'imahem ha-Leviim. Shmayahu, Netanyahu, Zvadyahu, Vasael, Ushmiramot, V'Yehonatan, V'Adonyahu, V'Tobiah, essentially a whole list of Levites, of Leviim. V'imahem Elishama, V'Yoram Kohanim, and with them Elishama and Yoram the priests. So in this fairly large group of people who are going out to teach the people, there are some nobles or officers of the court, mostly Levites. Like, remember, we saw the Leviim, the Levites were teaching the people with Ezra, and just 2 priests. Now, this is really unusual because normally the idea is that the priests teach the people, at least in earlier texts. But here we can already see, like in Ezra, that the people who seem to be kind of the core of this group are the Leviim, the Levites. Vayilamdu b'Yehuda v'imahem sefer Torat Adonai vayasobu b'chol arei Yehuda vayilamdu ba'am. And what do? They teach in Judah. And with them is a book of the Torah of God. And they go and they circle the cities of Yehuda and they teach the nation. And of course, the reward is Vayhi Pachad Adonai al kol mamlechot ha'aratzot asher svivot Yehuda v'lo nelchamu im Yehoshaphat. There was the fear of God on all these surrounding kingdoms that were around Judah, and they didn't, and so those surrounding kingdoms did not go to war with Yehoshaphat. And some of them bring tribute, etc. So it's not clear, is this the consequence, or is this simply another consequence of Yehoshaphat being very righteous, right? That he's both teaching the Torah and all the nations that are fearful of Judah and don't attack. But the part of this is, what's interesting about this passage is, once again, we have a real emphasis on the people learning. And unlike with Ezra, the people come. It's actually, what's nice with the story of Ezra is it's the people's initiative. They all come. They're like, okay, we got ready. We're ready for you to teach the Torah. They made him a little stand. They did everything, right? And they're ready to learn. Here, it's important for the ruling class, together with the Leviim, the Levites, and a couple priests, to make sure everyone learns the Torah, right? And they're going around to the different cities and teaching. They're like these itinerant teachers going from city to city. So is this reflecting something that was going on in Shivat Zion? It doesn't, in general, we don't consider it as something that was going on in the time of Yehoshaphat, because we have certain anachronisms that are throughout Devarim, throughout Chronicles. We have certain anachronisms that are kind of placed into an earlier time, right? It could be that there was some record of Yehoshaphat doing something, right? But it seems like this kind of teaching the Torah, especially talking about a book, a scroll of the Torah, that everyone's like, oh, this is the scroll of the Torah. This is the scroll of the teaching. Exactly what it includes, again, people are going to argue about it, but there's a scroll of the Torah that people are taking with them to teach all the people in the different cities. There's a royal mission, right, to go out and teach everyone the Torah from city to city. So the question is, was something like this happening actually during the return to Zion? Because the account that we have in the book of Nehemiah about Ezra is that he comes to Jerusalem. He's in Jerusalem, right? And he's teaching them before a gate in Jerusalem, and so all the people are gathering. But people are spread out in Judea. They're not all near enough to the capital if you want everyone to learn. And so it does make sense that perhaps in a certain period, this was a way of kind of spreading the law. And also we see this idea of the law, the Torah, being important for rulers to make sure everyone knows. And again, that makes sense once we remember we think of the Torah as something separate from the law of the land. It is not separate from law of the land in Shivat Zion, at least not the way it's being presented to us. It's very much the law of the land. So you want everyone to know the law of the land. This is what you need to keep, right? I see that there's a comment from Moshe, I think it was from Moshe. Yes, from Moshe Matitya. That passage in Divrei Yamim can be read as a source for the notion that the study of Torah protects the nation from military attack. Yeah, I think absolutely you are right. Because if you just reading that passage, that is how it sounds. It sounds like they made sure all people in different cities, they taught Torah throughout Judea, and the result was that the fear of God was on the nations and they did not attack. I think that you can absolutely say that. What have we seen here? We're just kind of in the beginning of looking at how the Torah and the law was seen and interpreted in Shivat Zion and the Return to Zion. And what we see is that there's absolutely, as opposed to earlier times when it isn't super clear that people are referring to a written Torah. There are arguments, the prophets are making arguments. There are laws that people know. There are certain rules and things they should be doing that people know. But there's usually not a reference to a written Torah, except in certain laws there are. But in terms of the prophets, you don't usually see them talking about necessarily someone's reading from a scroll. This is what you're keeping, right? Of course, we do have the account of Yoshiyahu, of Josiah, finding the scroll, right? And now we know what to do. So similarly here we have Ezra reading, and his job is to teach everyone. They want to learn. There's a general desire to learn and an understanding that they need to be taught. This needs to be taught and explained. But no, you should not cry if you find you missed something. Don't cry. God wants you to be happy, which is a nice thought, right? God wants you to be happy. It's a holy day. God wants you to be happy. And then following up, they discover a holiday that everyone's forgotten about, and everyone is happy. Everyone builds Sukkot, and it sounds like everyone is having a pretty good time. I mean, they have a pretty good time after the reading of the Torah because they all eat and drink and are merry. And then when it comes to Sukkot, they are, not only do they build Sukkot, they spend all of Sukkot, again, learning Torah from Ezra for 7 days. And then by the 8th day, they already know about the 8th day holiday, and they are all set, right? And similarly, we saw this, the importance that in Divrei Yamim, in Chronicles, they have to, again, learning the Torah and teaching the Torah as a scroll that is being brought to the cities to be taught, right? And as something that's a job not just of the Kohanim, and not even just of the Levites, but of the royal class, of the royal court, to make sure that everyone knows the Torah. So in our next class, we're going to look a little bit more in terms of teaching the Torah, interpreting the Torah. We're going to look at another example actually from Divrei Yamim, from Chronicles, where we also see an interpretation of the Torah, where it's very clear that there's a kind of a desire to harmonize the different parts of the Torah that don't seem to work together. And we're going to look at Shabbat in particular and how that kind of plays out, not only Nehemiah, but particularly Nehemiah, and what Shabbat is supposed to include.
Is this a specifically sort of Jewish thing of having teachers going around and trying to teach the religious texts to the populace?
That is an excellent question. Like if you asked me earlier, I would say, yeah, probably it is more Jewish than not. But this period, I'd have to actually look and see what was going on in the Persian world. It seems to me the accessibility of it would be uniquely Jewish. In many ways, like the accessibility of prayer, where there's this idea in the Torah narrative, like in Breshit and Genesis and throughout up through Judges and Shmuel and all that anyone can turn to God in prayer, right? Any person can turn to God in prayer and in their own words pray to God, right? And have someone listening and have someone hearing. That is pretty unusual. In other words, you're not a king, you're not anyone special. You can just say something to God in your own words with the hope that God listens. And that's an idea. It's not my idea. It's Moshe Greenfield's idea that this is something unique about the Jewish people, the Israelite people and Jewish people, that everyone has a relationship with God. And so anyone can actually just say in their own words and using their own kind of mannerisms that they can pray to God. And I think that the Torah and the way it's being presented here, knowing how populous the whole thing is, everyone's like, hey, read the Torah. And then everyone's explaining it to everyone. And then everyone's doing things on their own and celebrating. The Torah is not being presented as an elite project. It's being presented as something that truly belongs to the people and that should be conveyed to the people. And the point is the people. So thank you for that question. I think that's a really important point, and we'll end on that. So looking forward to seeing everyone next week.